What if your reflection wasn't just an image, but a portal to a version of you molded by your darkest fears and regrets? Adriano Martins, a seasoned freelance photographer drawn to abandoned places, was about to confront that horrifying possibility. Known for capturing hauntingly beautiful images of forgotten structures, he was lured by whispers of an enigmatic park called Park of Shadows. Decades ago, this carnival was a place of joy and laughter. But now, it stands as a desolate wasteland, abandoned after a string of strange disappearances. At the heart of the park lies the Labyrinth of Mirrors, a maze that local legends say can twist your mind and trap your soul. Adriano, skeptical yet intrigued, ventured into the park one overcast evening. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and rust. His steps echoed through the eerie silence, broken occasionally by the groan of wind passing through decrepit rides. The shattered remains of a carousel loomed in the mist, its faded horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes chipped and lifeless. Yet, it wasn't the carousel that held Adriano's focus. It was the labyrinth. The structure seemed to pulsate faintly in the twilight, its cracked mirrors reflecting distorted fragments of the overgrown park. He couldn't shake the feeling that the labyrinth was watching him, waiting for him to step closer. As he approached, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The entrance was adorned with the words, "Find yourself inside," crudely etched into the tarnished frame above. The words seemed to mock him, daring him to uncover truths best left buried. Adriano hesitated, clutching his camera as if it were a shield. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped into the darkness. The world behind him seemed to vanish, swallowed whole by the labyrinth's oppressive silence. Inside, the first few mirrors reflected only him, his rugged face, his determined eyes, his steady camera. But soon, subtle changes began to creep in. A faint scar appeared across his cheek in one reflection, though his face bore no such mark. In another, his eyes gleamed a sickly yellow. Adriano blinked, stepping closer to the glass, but the image remained unchanged. A soft whisper echoed behind him. He spun around, camera ready, but the corridor was empty. Just as he exhaled, the whisper came again, this time from the mirror in front of him. "Why are you here?" it hissed, the voice eerily similar to his own. Adriano's breath quickened, and his hands trembled. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a maze of glass. It was alive, feeding on his presence. And as the faint sound of distorted laughter began to ripple through the corridors, Adriano realized he wasn't alone. Something was in there with him, lurking just out of sight, and it was far from human. What would you do in Adriano's place? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to uncover more terrifying tales like this. Adriano's first steps inside the Labyrinth of Mirrors were met with an oppressive silence that seemed to devour every sound. The air was cold, unnaturally so, carrying the faint metallic tang of something old and decayed. The mirrors lined each side of the narrow corridors, cracked in places, their surfaces dull but still able to reflect distorted fragments of light. As he moved deeper, the faint echo of his footsteps became warped, as if the sound itself was being manipulated. His breathing, shallow and uneven, seemed too loud against the crushing quiet. At first, the reflections appeared normal. His rugged face, the camera slung around his neck, his sturdy boots pressing against the cracked tiles. But then something shifted. The reflections began to lag, as if they were struggling to keep up with his movements. He raised his hand, and for a split second, his reflection didn't follow. When it finally moved, its delay sent a jolt of unease through him. He shook his head, muttering about tricks of the light, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. As Adriano turned a corner, the mirrors on either side began to distort, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. He paused, his fingers hovering over the camera's shutter, but his instincts told him not to raise it. Instead, he focused on his surroundings. The once silent air now carried faint noises, a child's laugh, distant and warped, followed by a sharp, chilling sob. His pulse quickened as he called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice bounced back at him, fragmented and wrong, as if the labyrinth was mocking him. Pushing forward, Adriano noticed one of the mirrors ahead wasn't like the others. Its surface was pristine, untouched by time or decay, and it glimmered faintly even in the dim light. Approaching cautiously, he peered into it, expecting to see his own weary reflection. But the image staring back at him wasn't his. The figure wore his face, his clothes, but its expression was hollow, its eyes dark and void of emotion. Adriano stumbled back, his heart pounding. When he dared to look again, the reflection was gone, replaced by his usual, albeit shaken visage. Adriano whispered to himself, "It's just my imagination." Nothing more, as he moved forward, determined to capture the essence of this eerie place. He steadied his camera and clicked a picture of one of the warped reflections. As the flash illuminated the corridor, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a shadow darting behind him. He whipped around, camera at the ready, but the path was empty. Still, the air felt thicker now, charged with something unseen yet undeniably present. Turning another corner, he froze. A mirror directly ahead was showing something impossible. It wasn't reflecting him or the corridor he stood in. It showed a vast, barren wasteland under a blood-red sky. The ground was cracked and dry, and in the distance, twisted figures writhed in the haze. Adriano stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the glass. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a loud crack echoed through the labyrinth, and the image dissolved into nothingness. As the tension mounted, Adriano became acutely aware of how disoriented he was. Every turn seemed to loop back to the same corridors, the same mirrors. His reflection continued to play tricks on him, sometimes delayed, sometimes smirking when his face remained neutral. The faint sounds of laughter grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to call his name. The labyrinth wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it was watching him. Worse, it was toying with him, pulling him deeper into its twisted heart. What Adriano didn't know yet was that the labyrinth wasn't just a maze of mirrors, it was a trap. And once it began to reflect your fears, there was no way out. The deeper Adriano ventured into the Labyrinth of Mirrors, the more its oppressive presence began to seep into his mind. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself was resisting his movement. The mirrors on either side grew more distorted, their surfaces warping and shifting like liquid. His own reflection now seemed alien, its movements not only delayed but exaggerated, as if mocking him. Adriano tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the narrow corridor ahead, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The back of his neck prickled with an unnatural chill, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like a breeze carrying faint voices. He stopped, holding his breath to listen. The whispers grew louder, blending together into a cacophony of unintelligible words. But one thing was clear, they were coming from the mirrors. Adriano's head snapped toward the nearest one, but its reflection showed only him, wide-eyed and visibly shaken. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it pressed against his ears like a physical weight. The absence of sound was almost worse than the whispers themselves. As he continued, the labyrinth seemed to shift. Corridors that should have been behind him now stretched endlessly ahead. He turned back, only to find himself face to face with his own reflection, though it wasn't moving at all. It stood perfectly still, staring at him with hollow, unblinking eyes. Adriano's breath hitched as he waved his hand, but the reflection didn't mimic the action. Instead, it tilted its head slowly, as if studying him. Then it smiled, a cruel, knowing grin that didn't belong on his face. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, and hurried down another corridor. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing around him in shrill, childlike tones. But there were no children here. Adriano's heart pounded as he turned a corner and found himself in a larger chamber. Dozens of mirrors lined the walls, their reflective surfaces casting his image from every angle. Yet none of them were the same. Some showed him older, his face gaunt and lined with wrinkles. Others showed him younger, but with strange, unnatural features, his eyes blackened, his mouth twisted into a grimace. One mirror in the center of the chamber caught his attention. Unlike the others, its frame was ornate, made of dark, twisted metal that seemed to pulsate faintly. The glass shimmered, and as Adriano approached, it revealed something horrifying. It wasn't his reflection staring back. It was a version of him, but grotesquely altered. His face was pale, his eyes glowing faintly red, and his expression was devoid of humanity. The figure raised a hand to the glass, beckoning him forward, its lips moving in a silent message Adriano couldn't decipher. A loud bang shattered the silence, and Adriano spun around, clutching his camera like a weapon. The sound came from behind him, yet there was nothing there, only the endless corridor stretching into darkness. His chest tightened, and his breathing grew erratic. He snapped a photo of the room, the flash illuminating the mirrors. For a brief moment, the light revealed something impossible. A crowd of figures standing just beyond the glass, their faces blurred, their eyes fixed on him. Adriano's hands trembled as he checked the photo on his camera. The image confirmed his fears. The figures were there, watching, waiting. He backed away, but the mirrors seemed to close in, narrowing the space around him. A faint humming sound filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, one of the mirrors cracked, the fissure spreading rapidly across its surface. The distorted reflection within began to bleed through the cracks, seeping like liquid onto the floor. Panicked, Adriano ran. The corridors twisted and turned in impossible ways, disorienting him further. The mirrors now reflected not only his image but twisted, nightmarish versions of the park itself. Rides that seemed to move on their own, shadows darting between the broken attractions. He could hear the whispers again, louder, insistent, as if they were right behind him. His pulse raced as he turned another corner and stopped dead in his tracks. In front of him stood a mirror, larger than any he'd seen before. Its surface was black, not reflective at all, and it seemed to pulse faintly like a beating heart. As Adriano approached, the whispers became clearer, forming words that sent a chill through his very core. "You belong here now." The black surface began to ripple, and something moved within it, something that was reaching out for him. Adriano froze, torn between the instinct to flee and the morbid curiosity drawing him closer. He had ventured into the labyrinth to uncover its secrets, but now those secrets were reaching out to claim him. And somewhere deep inside, he realized the horrifying truth. The labyrinth wasn't trying to trap him. It was trying to show him something he could never unsee. Adriano stood paralyzed before the massive black mirror, its surface rippling like dark water under a stormy sky. The whispers had now become a deafening chorus, overlapping voices that seemed to pour directly into his mind. They chanted his name, mocking him, accusing him, and calling him closer. The air grew dense and cold, and Adriano's breath condensed into thick clouds as he tried to back away. But his legs felt rooted to the floor, as if the labyrinth itself refused to let him leave. The mirror began to change. Shapes formed within its liquid-like surface, figures writhing and twisting, their outlines vague but unmistakably human. One of them stepped closer to the glass, pressing its hand against the surface. Adriano's stomach churned as he realized the figure's face was his own, but twisted and grotesque. Its skin was pale and cracked like dried earth, its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, and its mouth curled into an unnatural, predatory grin. "Why run, Adriano?" the reflection whispered, its voice a distorted mimicry of his own. "You've already lost." Before he could react, the reflection slammed its fist against the glass, and the mirror shattered outward. But instead of shards, the fragments dissolved into a thick, black mist that filled the corridor. The mist crept toward him, cold and suffocating, carrying the faint scent of rot. Adriano turned to flee, but the corridors were no longer the same. They had shifted, their walls now lined with mirrors that didn't reflect him, but instead showed moments from his past, moments he had tried desperately to forget. In one mirror, he saw himself standing in an empty apartment, an eviction notice crumpled in his hand. In another, he was arguing with an old friend, his voice harsh, his words cutting. The mirrors seemed to feed on his guilt, dragging out every regret, every failure. "You can't hide from yourself," the voices taunted, now coming from the reflections themselves. Each image felt more real than the last, as if the mirrors were windows into his soul. Adriano's panic reached a fever pitch when one of the mirrors showed a moment he didn't recognize. It depicted him standing over a lifeless body, blood staining his hands. He staggered backward, shaking his head. "No, that's not me," he whispered, but the whispers replied in unison, "Not yet." As he stumbled through the labyrinth, Adriano came to a new chamber, a circular room with no apparent exits. The walls were covered entirely in mirrors, each one reflecting a version of himself. Some were younger, others older, but all of them had something wrong. Missing eyes, twisted limbs, faces contorted in agony or rage. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a cracked, antique mirror. Its frame was ornate, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist when he looked at them. Compelled by a force he couldn't understand, Adriano approached the pedestal. His trembling fingers reached out to touch the mirror, and the moment his skin made contact, a blinding light filled the chamber. He closed his eyes against the glare, but when he opened them, he was no longer alone. Standing across the room was his doppelganger, the same grotesque version of himself he had seen earlier. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. "You've seen the truth," it rasped, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "The labyrinth doesn't lie. It shows you what you are, and what you will become." Adriano's heart pounded as the figure reached out a hand. "Join me," it said. "Embrace what you've hidden from the world, from yourself. There's no escape from who you truly are." Desperate, Adriano grabbed the mirror from the pedestal and held it between himself and the doppelganger. The figure let out a guttural scream as its reflection was forced back into the glass. The room shook violently, the mirrors on the walls cracking and shattering one by one. Adriano clutched the antique mirror, feeling its weight grow heavier in his hands as the doppelganger's form twisted and dissolved into the glass. The light dimmed, and the whispers faded into silence. Adriano was back in the corridor, but the labyrinth was different now. The mirrors were dull and lifeless, no longer reflecting anything. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he looked down at the antique mirror in his hands. Its surface was smooth and polished, but deep within he could still see faint shadows moving, his doppelganger, trapped but far from gone. Adriano's relief was short-lived. As he turned to find the exit, he realized the corridors were closing in, the walls narrowing, leaving him no path but forward. He clutched the mirror tightly, his only weapon against the labyrinth's relentless grip. But deep down, he knew the truth. The labyrinth was far from finished with him. It had shown him his darkest fears and regrets, but it wasn't content with just showing. It wanted him to stay, forever. When Adriano finally stumbled out of the labyrinth, gasping for air, he found himself standing in the middle of the park, drenched in sweat. The sky was no longer the soft gray of dusk. It had turned a deep, unnatural shade of red, casting everything in a haunting, blood-soaked hue. The air was thick and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Adriano's chest heaved as he clutched the antique mirror he had wrested from the labyrinth. Its surface shimmered faintly, and shadows flickered within, as though it still contained the presence of his doppelganger. At first, he thought he had escaped, but something was wrong. The park, once eerie but familiar, now felt alien. The rusting carousel loomed in the distance, but its once motionless horses now seemed to move subtly, their heads shifting to follow him. The faint creak of swings echoed from the empty playground, and a distant calliope played a discordant melody that sent chills down his spine. Adriano turned to look at the labyrinth behind him, but it was gone. In its place stood an empty void, a darkness so complete it swallowed all light. He fumbled for his camera, seeking comfort in the lens that had always been his tool to make sense of the world. Lifting it, he snapped a picture of the park, and the flash illuminated the area briefly. But when he reviewed the photo, his heart sank. The image didn't show the park as it was. Instead, it showed him still inside the labyrinth, staring into the endless reflections of his distorted self. The realization struck him like a blow. He might have left the labyrinth physically, but some part of him was still trapped within. Desperate for answers, Adriano decided to leave the park entirely. But as he moved toward the exit gates, they seemed farther away with every step. The paths twisted and elongated, leading him in circles. Landmarks he swore he'd passed moments ago now appeared ahead of him, as if the park itself was rearranging to keep him inside. His frustration grew, and he shouted into the empty air, "What do you want from me?" The only response was a low, guttural laugh that echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. Adriano spun around, his pulse racing, but saw nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as though countless eyes were boring into him from the shadows. When he finally reached what should have been the gates, they stood wide open. Beyond them was his car, parked exactly where he had left it. Relieved, he sprinted toward it, clutching the antique mirror tightly. But as he reached the threshold of the park, a force stopped him cold. It was as if an invisible wall barred his escape. The wind howled, and he heard the whispers again, this time louder, clearer, and unmistakably malicious. "You can't leave," they hissed. "Not yet." Adriano fell to his knees, his mind racing. He glanced at the mirror in his hands and noticed something new. The shadows within had grown clearer, coalescing into the shape of his doppelganger. Its cruel grin spread wide as it spoke through the glass. "You thought you could just walk away? The labyrinth isn't a place, Adriano. It's a part of you now." Panicked, Adriano hurled the mirror to the ground, hoping to shatter it and end the nightmare. But the glass didn't break. Instead, it absorbed the impact, its surface rippling like water. The voice from within laughed again, louder this time, echoing through the empty park. "You can't destroy what you've become," it sneered. Adriano's grip on reality began to slip. Was he still in the labyrinth, or had he truly escaped? Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified, distorted, as if the world around him was unraveling. Determined to break the mirror's hold over him, he grabbed his camera and began snapping photos of the mirror, the park, anything that could provide clarity. But each photo told a different story. In one, the park was vibrant and full of life, children laughing and playing. In another, it was a desolate wasteland consumed by fire. And in the final photo, Adriano saw himself standing in the labyrinth, his face twisted into the grotesque form of his doppelganger. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The labyrinth wasn't just a physical place. It was a reflection of his fears, his regrets, and his darkest secrets. It had shown him not just what he was, but what he could become. And now, it had followed him into the real world, reshaping everything around him. As the whispers grew louder, Adriano looked back at the mirror one last time. His reflection stared back, its expression blank and hollow. Slowly, the reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, as if trying to cross into his world. Adriano staggered back, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The labyrinth had shown him the truth, but it had also taken something from him. And whatever it left behind was no longer entirely Adriano Martins. The park grew darker, the shadows closing in. Adriano's grip on reality faltered, and the lines between the labyrinth and the world blurred. He was trapped, not in a maze of mirrors, but within the nightmare that had become his own mind. Adriano's days following his escape, or so he thought, from the labyrinth were marked by an overwhelming sense of unease. The world he returned to felt wrong, subtly altered in ways he couldn't quite place. Familiar streets seemed longer, the shadows cast by buildings stretched unnaturally, and even the faces of people he passed seemed hollow, their eyes avoiding his. The antique mirror, though locked away in the trunk of his car, continued to haunt him. He would often catch its faint whispers at the edge of his perception, as though it were calling to him, begging him to look deeper into its depths. Driven by a gnawing curiosity and desperation for answers, Adriano began to research the labyrinth and its sinister legend. His investigation led him to a local historian, an eccentric recluse named Elias Duarte, who had spent decades compiling stories about the Parque das Sombras. When Adriano arrived at Elias's cluttered, dimly lit home, the old man seemed reluctant to speak. His hands trembled as he flipped through yellowed papers and faded photographs. His voice hushed, as if afraid the labyrinth itself might overhear. The labyrinth, Elias began, his voice low and gravelly, is not a place that people simply enter. It is a doorway, an ancient construct designed to reflect the darkest parts of one's soul. It lures people who carry heavy burdens, unresolved guilt, or hidden desires. And those who leave, well, they never truly leave. Adriano leaned in, his heart pounding. What do you mean? I made it out, but things haven't felt the same since. Elias hesitated before continuing. You didn't escape, he said, his gaze piercing. The labyrinth is inside you now. It doesn't let go. It follows you, reshaping reality around you, until you accept what it's showing you, or it consumes you entirely. Adriano's stomach churned as Elias revealed more. According to old accounts, the labyrinth's mirrors weren't ordinary glass. They were crafted from obsidian harvested from a cursed mountain, enchanted by an ancient cult seeking to bind their fears and desires into physical form. The labyrinth fed on the weaknesses of its victims, drawing energy from their torment. Elias gestured toward a tattered sketch of the labyrinth's original design, its layout resembling a spiral, a symbol of infinity, of inescapable entrapment. What can I do? Adriano asked, his voice trembling. How do I break free? There's no breaking free, Elias replied. The only way out is through. You must face whatever it is the labyrinth has shown you. Despite Elias's warnings, Adriano couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. He returned to his car that night, his fingers hesitating on the trunk's latch. When he finally opened it, the mirror seemed to hum faintly, its surface shimmering with a life of its own. Gathering his courage, he brought it inside and placed it on his desk. For hours, he stared into its depths, but the glass remained dark, revealing nothing. Exhausted, he fell asleep, but his dreams offered no solace. In his sleep, Adriano found himself back in the labyrinth. The corridors stretched endlessly, their mirrors alive with grotesque reflections of himself. But this time, the reflections spoke. Each version of Adriano accused him of a different failure, abandoning loved ones, prioritizing his ambition over relationships, and running from his fears. The voices grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar until he woke up drenched in sweat, the mirror on his desk glowing faintly in the dim light. Determined to confront his demons, Adriano set out to the park once more, bringing the mirror with him. The park's gates, once rusted and decaying, now stood impossibly tall, their iron bars twisted into shapes that resembled screaming faces. The air felt heavier than before, pressing against his chest as he walked through. The rides, though unmoving, creaked faintly as if mocking his return. The labyrinth was no longer visible, but Adriano felt its pull, an invisible thread guiding him deeper into the park. As he reached the center of the park, the mirror in his hands began to vibrate. Its surface rippled, and the reflection of the park around him melted away, replaced by a swirling void. The whispers returned, louder and clearer, calling him by name. Adriano hesitated, but something inside him, a mix of dread and morbid curiosity, urged him to step closer. Holding the mirror before him, Adriano demanded answers. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing into the stillness. The mirror's surface shifted, and for the first time, it showed something unmistakably real. His childhood home, his parents arguing in the background, and a young Adriano hiding in the corner, tears streaming down his face. The scene changed to his first major fight with his best friend, his words cruel and cutting. Then another shift, to a hospital room, where Adriano stood over the bed of an elderly woman, her hand reaching for his, but he turned and left before she could speak. The mirror spoke, its voice a chilling blend of his own and something otherworldly. "You carry so much regret, Adriano. So many choices you wish you could undo. But the labyrinth doesn't erase, it reveals. And now you must choose. Will you face yourself, or will you let the shadows consume you?" Adriano's hands trembled as the mirror grew heavier, its surface pulsing like a heartbeat. He realized that whatever force had tethered the labyrinth to him wouldn't stop until he confronted the truths he had buried deep within himself. But could he survive what the labyrinth demanded of him? The line between fear and courage was razor thin, and as Adriano took a hesitant step forward, the shadows around him began to shift, preparing to claim him if he faltered. Adriano stood at the heart of the park, the mirror clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The air around him grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Shadows crept from the edges of the park, slithering across the ground like living tendrils, converging toward him. The labyrinth was no longer a place, it was alive, and it was watching. Adriano's breaths were shallow, each exhale visible in the frigid air as his resolve wavered. Deep inside, he knew this was it. The labyrinth had brought him back for one purpose, to confront the thing he feared most, himself. The mirror in his hands began to pulse, a rhythmic vibration that resonated with his own heartbeat. Its surface shimmered and then blackened, no longer reflecting the world around him. Instead, it revealed a dark void, swirling with shadows and faint whispers. From the depths of the mirror, something began to emerge. A figure, vague at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. Adriano froze as he recognized the form stepping through the glass. It was him, yet it wasn't. The figure was his doppelganger, grotesque and twisted. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, its grin unnaturally wide, and its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. The creature stepped closer, its distorted reflection flickering in the shattered remains of the mirrors around them. "You've come so far," it rasped, its voice a distorted echo of Adriano's. "But do you truly understand why you're here?" Adriano's voice wavered as he replied, "I came for answers. To end this nightmare." The doppelganger laughed, a hollow, guttural sound that reverberated through the park. "End it? You don't end the labyrinth. You are the labyrinth. Every choice, every failure, every regret. This place is you, Adriano. And now it's time to decide. Will you embrace the truth, or will you run from it, as you always have?" The creature lunged toward Adriano, its movements unnervingly fast. He stumbled back, raising the mirror defensively. The glass reflected the doppelganger, but the reflection twisted and writhed, its image shattering into countless fragments. Adriano's mind raced as he realized the mirror wasn't just a tool. It was the key. It had shown him his past, his regrets, and his darkest truths, and now it demanded a choice. The shadows around them coalesced, forming an oppressive wall that boxed Adriano in. The doppelganger's grin widened as it spoke. "You can't run. Not anymore. Choose. Accept what you are, or let me take your place." Adriano's heart pounded as he struggled to understand. "Take my place? What does that mean?" The creature stepped closer, its voice a venomous whisper. "You don't deserve this life, Adriano. You squander it, bury it under fear and guilt. But I can fix that. All you have to do is give in." The labyrinth trembled, its mirrors vibrating violently as the choice loomed over Adriano. Memories flashed through his mind, the arguments, the betrayals, the faces of those he had failed. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, but beneath it, he felt a flicker of something else, resolve. He had spent his life running from his mistakes, but now, the labyrinth had stripped him bare, leaving him with no choice but to face them. "No," Adriano said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You're not me. You're what I fear I'll become. But I'm still here. And I'm not giving in. The doppelganger's grin faltered, its glowing eyes narrowing with rage. The shadows surged toward Adriano, but he lifted the mirror, holding it between them. The glass glowed brightly, its surface rippling as the doppelganger's reflection was sucked back into the void. The creature screamed, a sound that shook the very ground beneath them, but Adriano held firm, his grip unwavering. As the last of the shadows disappeared into the mirror, the labyrinth began to dissolve. The mirrors cracked and crumbled, their shards turning to dust. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a faint, golden light. Adriano collapsed to his knees, the mirror still clutched in his hands, its surface now clear and calm. The park around him was quiet, eerily so. The rides were still, the air no longer heavy with malice. Adriano rose slowly, his legs trembling, and made his way to the gates. This time, they didn't stretch endlessly away from him. They stood open, inviting him to leave. But as he crossed the threshold, he glanced back at the park one last time. The labyrinth was gone, but its presence lingered in his mind. Adriano knew he wasn't the same person who had entered that maze. The labyrinth had forced him to confront his fears, his regrets, and his failures. And though he had emerged victorious, a part of him would always remain within those twisted corridors, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had overcome. As he walked away, the faint sound of laughter echoed behind him. Adriano turned, but the park was empty. Clutching the mirror tightly, he whispered to himself, "It's over." Yet deep down, he knew the labyrinth's whispers would never truly fade. It was a part of him now, a dark reflection that would always linger in the corners of his mind, waiting for the moment he dared to look too closely. Adriano walked away from the park, the antique mirror held tightly under his arm. The weight of the object felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more than just its physical form. The night had grown quiet, eerily so, with only the faint rustle of wind through the trees to keep him company. Yet, every step he took away from the shadow park felt like it brought him closer to something unseen. The labyrinth may have vanished from view, but its presence lingered, seeping into the edges of his reality like a shadow that refused to fade. As he reached his car, he paused, glancing back at the park one last time. The gates stood wide open, the darkness beyond them still and uninviting. But for a brief moment, Adriano thought he saw movement, a flicker of light, the glint of something reflective. He blinked, and it was gone. Shaking his head, he opened the trunk and placed the mirror inside, slamming it shut with a finality that echoed in the still night air. He didn't want to look at it again, not now, not ever. The drive home was unsettling. The road stretched on endlessly, the headlights carving a path through the dense fog that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Adriano kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. The radio, which he hadn't touched, crackled to life, emitting faint whispers that sounded disturbingly familiar. He turned it off, but the static persisted, a low hum that burrowed into his mind. The shadows on the roadside seemed to shift and writhe, and he couldn't tell if it was his exhaustion or something far worse playing tricks on him. When he finally reached his apartment, Adriano felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He locked the door behind him, double-checking it, and leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. But as he turned on the lights, his relief was short-lived. The apartment didn't feel like his anymore. The furniture was the same, the photos on the wall unchanged, yet everything seemed wrong. The air was heavier, colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be. Adriano hesitated before entering his bedroom. His gaze was drawn to the full-length mirror standing in the corner, a piece he had owned for years but had never thought twice about. Now it loomed like a silent sentinel, its surface reflecting the faint light from the hallway. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. When he looked into the glass, his reflection stared back, but something was off. The figure in the mirror seemed delayed, its movements just a fraction of a second behind his own. "Not again," he whispered, stepping back, but the reflection didn't mimic him. It stood still, its eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then it smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent a chill down his spine. Adriano turned away, refusing to look any longer, but the faint sound of tapping drew his attention back. The reflection's hand was pressed against the glass, as if trying to break through. Panicking, Adriano threw a sheet over the mirror, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and was soon joined by a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. He covered his ears, backing away toward the door, but the whispers only grew louder, forming words that chilled him to his core. "You belong to us now." The rest of the night was a blur of restless pacing, muffled whispers, and the oppressive weight of the mirror's presence. When morning finally came, Adriano stepped outside, desperate for sunlight and normalcy. But the world outside wasn't the same. The people on the street seemed distant, their faces blurred, their movements mechanical. The sounds of the city were muted, replaced by the faint hum he had heard in the labyrinth. It was as if the labyrinth's influence had seeped into everything, distorting his reality piece by piece. Adriano tried to carry on with his life, but the labyrinth wouldn't let him go. The antique mirror remained locked in his trunk, yet its whispers followed him everywhere. Reflections in windows, puddles, and even polished surfaces showed glimpses of his doppelganger, lurking just beyond the glass. The photographs he took with his camera began to change, showing twisted versions of the world around him. The lines between reality and the labyrinth blurred further with each passing day. Weeks later, Adriano returned to the park, compelled by an unseen force. The gates were closed this time, the sign above them rusted and unreadable. But as he approached, they creaked open slowly, as if welcoming him back. He stepped inside, the air immediately colder, the familiar silence wrapping around him like a shroud. The labyrinth had returned, its entrance waiting for him at the heart of the park. Adriano hesitated, his heart pounding, but he knew there was no escaping it. The labyrinth wasn't just a place. It was a part of him now, a living entity that demanded his return. As he stepped inside, the mirrors flickered to life, their surfaces rippling with shadows and whispers. He walked forward, his reflection smiling back at him with that same cruel grin. The labyrinth had reclaimed him, and this time, there would be no escape. What would you do if faced with the labyrinth's horrifying truths? Could you confront your darkest fears, or would you let them consume you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling tales like this. The labyrinth always finds its way back. Will you be ready?